Alright, afternoon all. I'm just going to briefly touch on Project Cactus before we start talking about the book report again. Cactuses still aren't germinating, but we weren't really expecting them to for another 2 weeks or so. So, in another 2 weeks, we'll start seeing whether or not we're going to have a 0% success rate on the cactuses. Also, I actually found I really enjoy writing these and doing these. I find them kind of relaxing to do between real work. So before this afternoon, I go back in and start doing real work. I wanted to go ahead and move on to part two of Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity. So this isn't going to be a point by point review where we follow her argument sentence by sentence. I'm really just trying to pull out the parts I find interesting that help frame her argument, and it's really a sort of stream of consciousness for me to help understand what she's saying and make it more relatable. You'll get the most out of these, of course, if you read the book yourself. You can also find the first part of me talking through her book in the transcript link. It's in the transcript below. I guess it's technically on the blog, not below. Anyway, a lot of this is philosophy is going to be done by squinting, I want to say. If you want to get into the weeds of specific philosophies, this isn't really going to do that for you. So I'm not always going to be perfectly exact. I'm going to try and keep it close enough so that the discussion is moving for my purposes and accurate, but if you hear something and you're like, well, that's not exactly right, it's again because this is philosophy by squinting. We're just trying to move through the argument and get a foundational understanding. So, part two is called Personal Freedom and Others. Yes, and others. What she's saying here is a pretty natural follow up to part one. You probably aren't going to need a lot of my help to understand the thrust of her argument here because, as you'll see when we get there, it's something that you're probably familiar with. So instead, I want to start by giving you some context to better understand this chapter. One of the things you need to know is that alongside existentialism at this time, there's another philosophy kicking around. You may be familiar with it. It's called nihilism, nihilism, however you want to pronounce it. It's been around a long time in, well, maybe not really by philosophy standards, but the form that most people are familiar with is probably the one popularized by Nietzsche, firmly established, mattering how you want to say a philosophy gets established, late 1800s to early 1900s. To help set the stage again, Simone de Beauvoir, born in 1908, so she's very familiar with nihilism growing up. It's something that is not new to her. She is aware of this. It's part of her world as she's growing up. In fact, all three of the big existentialists, and, well, I call them the big three existentialists. Other people might have different opinions. Anyway, Camus, Sartre, and Beauvoir, they're very clear that they are aware of nihilism, and they're also very clear that they're not fans of it. Because these two philosophical gangs, if you want to call them that, don't see eye to eye. But just like anyone else where you disagree with, they kind of start at roughly the same place, which is what makes their disagreement all the more profound. They start basically that the world is this stark reality and man is thrust into this world and has to sort of react to the world. Again, philosophy by squinting here. So existentialism's answer to these facts about the world is that, well, okay, so the world has no pre-existing meaning, right? The world exists, man exists. But, therefore, man has to craft his own meaning in this world. You, as Beauvoir is going to go on to explain, need to establish ethics by how you decide things and how you wish to interact with the world and your fellow man. Nihilism is going to take a different tact. Existentialists ground themselves with reality and man exist. Nihilists are brave enough to ask the question, do we though? And to accept the logical conclusion that even if we do exist, we don't matter. So, to put this in another way, Existentialists are an optimistic if dreary outlook on the world, right? World exists, it sucks, make something out of it. Nihilists sort of stop midway through that process. They never get to the so make something of it or inject meaning into it. It's rank pessimism in this, popularized view of what nihilism is. The world has no meaning. There's no guiding light. There's no purpose. Those are your familiar nihilistic conclusions. You'll also, if you read more, get to some other odder arguments that you're probably not familiar with, such as, well, there's no defined order and there's no defined knowledge. That's a really hard argument to follow on, but it's the sort of thinking that you might get. So that's the difference between our two philosophies, and Beauvoir is going to be talking about nihilism a lot, and she's going to give it a fairly solid thrashing throughout this chapter. Now, it's not just that there's this philosophical difference between Beauvoir and the nihilists, because, again, as the old commercials used to say, right, she's not just an owner of existentialism, she's a customer. And what brought her to this philosophy, and it may not be the thing, but it was one of the things, is this brutal little event in the 1940s known as World War II. I remembered this quote from her, but I had to go look it up to find a link so that I could put it in the transcript. And the quote is, she's talking to, I believe it was her biographer at the time, to tell you the truth, I'm not proud of what I was then, 30 years old and completely self-centered. I regret that it took the war to teach me that I lived in the world, not outside it. And just from that quote, you can see the basics of this ethics of ambiguity building there, right? Personal freedom's important. You can't be focused just on the self. You have to acknowledge reality and other people, and that we live in this reality, in this world, and we can't just be, living in an ivory tower looking down upon it. So all of that brings us back to actually getting to the meat of part 2 and talking about this book. Because, again, she's going to be talking about personal freedom here. But I don't want you to think that it's just this sort of existential idea that you freely choose and that you can choose whatever you want to choose. She's also talking that there are literal freedoms that people have, and that in her experience living through World War II, seeing Soviet Russia, seeing all of these other failed governments from, end of World War I to the 1940s, when she's, coming into her own as a writer in the late early 30s or so. Like, she's seeing all of this, the failure of Germany post World War I, the failure of France in World War II. She's familiar with the idea of actual personal freedom, not just on the existential level, but on the literal, governments will kill you based on their inability to understand personal freedom. So when she's talking about it, you have to remember that she's not just taking this 10,000 feet in the air view that, freedom is what we choose. She literally saw people marched to gas chambers. So this is why a lot of her time in this book is going to be spent on it. Now, again, book was originally published in 1948. She was probably writing it. I don't know exactly when she would have started writing it. Well, I guess the first printing was 48, so maybe there were some drafts circulating before then. World War II is very recent for this. So this condemnation of the nihilistic view of governments is a direct response to Nazi Germany and the extremes that you're going to see coming out of this. So you need that background to see that this isn't just some philosophical debate going on, but she's viewing this from a moral lens that actually, she saw what she viewed as people who failed this existentialist freedom ideal, and she saw the horror it ravaged through Europe for years. And that now lets us get to actually talking about the chapter itself. And here, this is going to be a little less heavy, right? If you've read the chapter, you probably haven't, but if you have, the first, 10 pages of the chapter is something that was very novel at the time, but to us, it's basically the concept of agency. Agency is what makes someone free. And if you've ever been paying attention to modern criticism of media, you're like, does this character have agency? Did that character truly have agency? Only she's applying this to actual people. For example, she says, children naturally lack agency. They can't make choices, they don't really understand choices. But in adults, agency can either be taken away, in the example she gives is slavery, but also, as we saw in, World War II, the agency of people there was taken away. You can also surrender your agency through social or cultural influences. Beauvoir uses here the example of how society treated women and other minority groups. So, again, she's saying agency is important, and one needs to have agency to be able to reach this existential ideal of freedom. If you can't freely make decisions, then you can't reach that existential ideal. So anything which is denying people agency is unethical from this existentialist view. So while I'm saying that this isn't a novel concept, after all, basically the foundation of philosophy is people have to choose. How do we help them make choices, right? It's usually not worded that way. I don't know if you went back and looked at Plato or Aristotle, that was necessarily the foundation of what they were talking about. It was there, but it may not have been the thing. But the actual term agency that I'm using here, there's a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia on Philosophy, shows that I think it wasn't until the late 50s, early 1960s that agency, the term itself, starts getting used. So what Beauvoir is talking about here is a pretty novel idea that by now we can use one word to sum up what she spent 10 pages trying to explain. So the easiest way to view those pages is just to be truly free to choose, one must have agency. The rest of the chapter is listing all of the ways in which one can fail to be truly free, or how one's agency can be compromised. Again, we don't want to get into a blow-by-blow recounting of the chapter, but some examples are over-reliance on the other, denying the other, over-reliance on the self, or denying the self. No matter which way you fail, it all boils down to the fact that you have not chosen to exercise your own personal freedom, or you are infringing on the freedom of someone else. If you fail in any of these ways, in this existentialist view of ethics, you are acting unethically. So when you see that moral failing being cited here, it sounds very hard to put into practice if you don't remember everything we just talked about dealing with World War II, Nazis, communist Russia, all of that. So if you just think, oh, well, I didn't respect my own personal freedom, and you don't understand what that means on a moral level, she goes on to try and explain that to you through probably about the last third of the chapter. Those existentialist moral ethical failings are going to come to common moral failings you'd see in a more rule-based theory of ethics. So if you don't act in a way that's ethical to the existentialist view, you're going to fail morally in ways that you're probably more familiar with viewing. For example, Golden Rule or Ten Commandments style of ethics. You're going to reach the same failure if you don't do that as if you fail to act as an ethical existentialist. So, if you read that chapter again, when she's going over the failure in these ethics, you're going to be able to see that each failure there can pretty much directly relate to some moral failing you're more familiar with. The consequences and the actions that she's discussing start to become things that you will recognize as unethical behavior. People who are domineering, people who don't respect others' time, personal space, or personal boundaries. These are ethical frameworks that you're probably a lot more familiar with. Which brings us to C.S. Lewis, who mentions that there are some universal ethics written on the heart of man, because you can find those key concepts in pretty much any reliably robust philosophy, right? And someone's probably going to object to me calling certain goods or evils universal, but they kind of are. Like, you can go back and you can look at the Code of Hammurabi or the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and you could see that the same sorts of things that they're saying were evil or bad or deserving of punishment then are the very same things that a modern court will frown upon. There are also a lot of things that aren't the same. We're not saying that, there is a universal moral standard, but almost anywhere you look, murder is going to be frowned upon. There might be some difference of opinions of what's justifiable homicide, like what is self-defense, what, can the state kill you for theft, or does it need to be a capital crime? Like, there's going to be differences there, but there's still this concept of there are certain things that are good and bad. And honestly, if you're going to an ethical or moral philosophy and it doesn't say that, you can't just walk up to people and murder them, you may want to start looking for a more valid moral philosophy to base your life around. So, all of that brings us to, understanding what are the actual consequences of not acting as an ethical existentialist. The infringing on others' freedom or agency is always going to be acting immorally, as far as she's concerned here. Because, in part, and she'll stress this several times through the chapter, doing this rejects reality. And this is sort of going back to our earlier point and counterpoint about different philosophies. She views this as a very nihilistic worldview. If you deny reality and deny others their personal freedom, that's unethical, and that's what a nihilist would do, and she's not a big fan of nihilists. So, to close this up, I want to also point out that this view of existential ethics isn't just my own personal Christian worldview leaking in and coloring how I'm understanding it. Beauvoir's book actually points this out too. She quotes, I think she calls the person, doesn't give a name so I can't find out who it is. She quotes them as an anti-fascist priest saying that God had such respect for man that he created him free. Again, at pretty much the very end of the chapter, she says that to will oneself free is also to will others free. This freedom to choose, or free will as you might see in a Christian worldview or some other worldviews, free will in general is the foundation for existential ethics. And the failures to act ethically that will lead you to bad actions are based around not respecting that freedom or accepting the responsibility that comes with those freedoms. That parallel to understanding the concept of free will to this existentialist freedom is going to be really helpful if you had trouble grasping part 1 or part 2. Again, it's not a perfect parallel because, again, Beauvoir is coming from a view that the meaning of the world is decided by man, right? It is I don't want to say atheistic worldview, but there is a non-theistic portion of it. Her worldview does not require anything outside of man exists, reality exists to reach. But understanding what free will is and being able to view it in an existentialist view is going to help you understand and pull all of these parts that she's talking about together before we move into the last major part of the book, where she's going to start talking about the positive aspect of ambiguity. And that's what we'll hopefully tackle maybe next week, week after. So thank you for your time. Thanks for listening. And if you've got any other questions, let me know. But that's essentially Chapter 2, Personal Freedom by Simone de Beauvoir in her book, Ethics of Ambiguity.